Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CDC, but I can't really welcome you to CDC because you are CDC. This is the CDC family here, both current and former, including many former CDC directors. Welcome. Of course, you're never former CDC, you're always CDC, once CDC. And I want to thank you for coming here, and I'm honored to join you in both honoring and celebrating Steve Thacker. For many of us, Steve embodies the best of CDC. In fact, I would say he doesn't just embody the best of CDC, he embodies CDC. He is CDC for so many of us, which is why I think so many people have come. I will just mention one very brief story about my own first interaction with Steve. I had done my internal medicine training in New York City, and then 1 year of an infectious disease fellowship in New Haven. And the question was, did I count as a New York City resident? Could I go back to New York City for my EIS years? And it was, a judgment call. And Steve made the judgment that I could. And there is no doubt in my mind that my life would have been completely different otherwise. Steve's email sign-off is characteristic. Here to serve. And that really is what Steve's career shows. He loves CDC, and in turn, CDC loves Steve. He cares about CDC and the CDC community, and he also cares about other communities, whether it's basketball or the community of ideas, with books being perhaps the most voracious reader I've ever known. He also has a passion for history and a passion for improving the future. Steve is someone who I think all of us try to emulate. And what we've done to start us off is to prepare, and we'll show you a short video from many people, but only a tiny fraction of the people who Steve has inspired through the years.
How would I sum up Steve?
That's a lot to ask.
Well, there are
so many stories about Steve.
Well, it's not easy to sum up Steve.
Do you have any favorite stories about Steve?
No.
I used to work in an office building where the CDC pledge to the American people was on a plaque, and it was up on the wall by the door. I've been thinking a lot about that pledge recently, and I realized that many of Steve's personal characteristics and qualities, as well as his commitment to science and service, really embody all aspects of that pledge.
Steve has been, when it wasn't politically correct necessarily, just because he knew it was the right thing, a friend and an advocate for women at CDC.
He made every decision with fairness, absolutely at the top of his mind, and he was committed to social justice.
When we look at the EIS class and how it has evolved over the last 30 years, clearly it has become one of the most diverse groups of people in public health. And that happened because of Steve's leadership.
I went and interviewed with Steve Thacker. And in that interview, I shared with him that I was pregnant. And his reaction was wonderful. He said he was delighted and proceeded to pull out pictures of Maria, sharing how wonderful his little girl was. Although he had told me how delighted he was that I was having a child, and he shared that joy. He came over within 2 weeks of her birth and cooed over her as appropriate, and then said, by the way, here are some papers. I really hope you can get to these soon. And that was Steve. Productive, happy, wonderful.
Steve has a terrific dry sense of humor. Steve's daughters went to St. Pius, so we were standing outside the elevators at Century Center, and he said, David, did Maria decide which school she's going to? I said, she didn't take St. Pius, she went to the other school. And he said, would you mind waiting for the next elevator?
When I think of Steve, I think of what Jack Buck, the old St. Louis Cardinals broadcaster, said about Stan Musial. When you first hear about this guy, you say, it can't be true. Then when you first meet him, you say, it must be an act. But then as you watch him and you see how he performs and how he comports himself, you say, he's truly one of a kind. There'll never be another like him.
Steve is renowned for his scientific prowess, his attention to detail, his delivery of excellent products. As a scientist, he's a superb practitioner of epidemiology.
He could be the postage stamp for the U.S. Public Health Service or for CDC. He's what every EIS officer aspires to be.
I think he is the person primarily responsible for developing the scientific base for public health.
I know of no one who is more committed to the mission of the CDC and to public health than Steve Thacker.
We would try to talk about things that I thought were not work, and so one of Steve's passions was coaching girls' sports teams, and I'd always try to ask him about that. About the third or fourth time we talked about it, he began to tell me about all of the epidemiological research he'd been doing to determine whether or not warming up before exercise for these girls was a good or bad thing. And my first thought was, oh my goodness, I've been trying to talk non-work to him, and actually I've been talking to work. And then I realized, no, actually epidemiology is Steve's passion.
I think one of the things that's so remarkable about Steve is his comfort with talking with people, his comfort with really tough data to understand, and his deep commitment to CDC. It comes through in everything he does.
Have you ever seen Steve in a tie?
Well, I don't think I ever saw Steve in a tie.
I have never once seen Steve in a tie.
One occasion in New York during the EIS 50th, he got me good because he came to a black-tied gala with a tieless tux.
Somehow, with a black t-shirt and a jacket, he looked formal.
His standard substitute for a necktie, a turtleneck shirt.
In a LL Bean polo shirt, because that was his real uniform.
I don't think Steve knows what a tie is.
I would sum him up as a symbol of strength and leadership.
Honest.
Steve is fair, he's humble, and always optimistic.
Iconic.
He's just such a strong advocate for CDC and for public health.
He's a mensch. He's selfless.
Devoted public health servant.
Science-based.
Generous.
Obsessive reader.
Dedicated. He absolutely loves movies.
Devoted.
He's solid as a friend, solid as an epidemiologist, solid as a public health person.
The heart and soul of EIS.
Inspirational.
For me, Steve is a public health hero.
Inspiring.
They don't come any better.
I'm a great believer in social DNA. What continues on quite different than biological DNA. And I think of all the people he mentored. And of course, his social DNA continues on in what they will teach, but it'll continue on in all the people they in turn teach. So social DNA goes on forever. And I think that's a very happy legacy for a very happy person. And I continue to say thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Gracias, Steve.
Thanks for everything, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for everything.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker, for everything.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thacker.
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 Steve Thacker stood out as an EIS officer from the beginning. He had more training than most and had an international view, but most striking, he was an iconoclast. Steve came to the EIS in 1976, fresh from challenging the received wisdom that the then new technology of fetal monitoring improved fetal care. His research had shown that clinicians tended to overreact to monitoring data that suggested problems. When Legionnaire's disease struck Philadelphia in Steve's first month in the EIS, he was quickly picked to join that large investigation. The outbreak posed scientific challenges, but the politics and press interest were also tricky. Reporters were all over the investigators, initially even sitting on my desk at one point. To get things under control, state officials and I agreed to segregate the reporters from the CDC staff, with state officials offering briefings to reporters twice a day. But reporters wanted to see EIS officers in action, so that is where Steve came in. Given his research experience and the complexity of the investigation, I had put Steve in charge of the line list. He was the keeper of data on each ill person and the ultimate arbiter of who had a case of Legionnaire's disease. It was a good choice. Steve was garrulous but careful. His intelligence, humor, and lack of pretension opened essential paths of communication within the investigative team and beyond. The same traits made him an obvious choice to show reporters how EIS officers do their work. So on the third day of the investigation, trailed by reporters, Steve went off to interview a Legionnaire who was hospitalized with a suspected case. Gowned, gloved, and masked, he interviewed that Legionnaire as reporters hung on his every word, which would have been fine, except for the fact that he was sitting on the man's hospital bed, a blatant violation of infection control protocol that was recorded in photographs published that week in Newsweek and Time magazine. Although Steve's EIS posting was with the District of Columbia, he continued to work on Legionnaire's disease on and off after the Pennsylvania investigation. Perhaps his most important contribution to our knowledge of Legionnaire's disease was his re-investigation of a 1965 outbreak of pneumonia at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric hospital in D.C. John Bennett had investigated the St. Elizabeth outbreak when he was an EIS officer, but the agent had never been identified. In the fall of 1976, before we found the agent of Legionnaire's disease, John told me that when we solved Legionnaire's disease, we would solve the St. Elizabeth outbreak. Steve Thacker proved John right. In Steve's reinvestigation in 1977, with benefit of Legionella serology, he sharpened the focus on those 57 of the 81 cases that had documented pneumonia or serologic evidence of Legionnaire's disease with onset in the peak 7-week period. By focusing on the best documented cases, he could expect to find stronger associations with the actual source. Steve showed that these classic cases were 10 times as likely as non-cases to be exposed to sites of excavation in the part of the hospital campus where a water sprinkling system was being installed. The timing and pattern of excavation were consistent with airborne spread with an incubation period of 4 to 11 days, typical of Legionnaire's disease. Steve's findings provide some of the strongest evidence to date of excavation as a source of airborne Legionnaire's disease. Many years later, I was prompted by memories of Steve's groundbreaking work to suggest to him that CDC might want to re-examine a sample of EIS investigations to test the accuracy of the methods and conclusions. Indeed, as a consultant, I had had the chance to look into a couple of such investigations and had raised questions about them. Steve demurred. It seemed that with experience he had learned to couple sound political sense with his innate iconoclasm.
Good morning. I first met Steve Thacker in 1977 in Burlington, Vermont. I was a new EIS officer sent to investigate the first large outbreak of Legionnaire's disease after Philadelphia. Of course, the press was all over us. Steve was sent to help with the investigation when things got crazy. He knew Legionnaire's disease and, more importantly, had diplomatic skills. The investigation was a success, and Steve and I became friends. It worked because it's not about Steve. So how does Steve Thacker represent the essence of leadership for CDC and for public health? First, it's about science. Steve has been a leading force in developing the scientific basis for surveillance system evaluation. A WHO colleague said to me recently, "I wish we had the science base for program management evaluation that CDC has developed for surveillance." Steve also led by example, publishing over 240 papers using new methods of quantitative analysis as they came along, recognized in 2009 with CDC's Lifetime Scientific Achievement Award. He's been in demand to chair reviews of complex and controversial scientific topics because it's not about Steve. It's about science. The second essential theme of Steve's leadership is people. There have been over 2,000 EIS officers during Steve's leadership. He's received an award for his success in recruiting women and minorities. One glance at the website guest book shows how many lives Steve has touched, from the thousands of girls he coached in basketball to all those with whom he had day-to-day contact. I've personally encountered people all over the agency who have had in-depth collaborations with Steve. It's not about Steve. It's about strengthening colleagues. One could measure how Steve's leadership is valued by the positions he's held at CDC. He's worked for 5 CDC directors. He's led multiple organizations. When I was acting director of CDC, I called on Steve to be my acting deputy director. He had the judgment and the scientific skills. More importantly, I knew it's not about Steve. It's about service to CDC and the public's health. The final element of Steve's leadership is his vision. Having a great idea is actually the easy part. Turning the vision into reality is what matters. Steve recognized early on that CDC needed broad expertise. He created training programs for economists, behavioral scientists, and informatics experts. He championed some of the earliest informatics projects at CDC, such as NETS and EpiInfo. The Guide for Community Preventive Services shows how scientific rigor can be used to weigh the often messy evidence to recommend effective public health interventions and to identify areas where further research is needed. It's not about Steve. It's about the vision needed for the future. So thinking about that long ago fall in Vermont, 2 other comments. It was the peak of fall foliage season, but we didn't see a single tree. We were working too hard. The other memory is that Steve talked about Luce so vividly. She was like a member of the team. Steve truly knows the importance of his family. So, to family, friends, colleagues, community here today to celebrate